Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Hi, Hindy.
Hey, okay.
How are you?
Amazing. So good to see you.
Good to see you too. I can't see anything, and you can't see the craziness going on in the office now.
Okay.
So I think maybe we'll give it a few more minutes. Yeah, people are starting to join.
Definitely.
Hindy, when did you come home?
We come home right after Purim, like the Monday after. Yeah.
So really, like a week.
Are you
Wow.
coming the
Yeah.
Sure, it'll
22nd?
be hard to leave,
Crazy.
but we're all looking forward to seeing you.
I'm really excited to see everyone. So excited to see you. Oh
Yeah,
my
it's been a
gosh.
long time.
It's been a really long time, but it's also crazy. Like every single day I wake up, I'm like, it's a week.
I'm sure
It's a
there's a
week and
lot to do.
There's so much to do. Yeah. I mean, we don't have like furniture that we have to get rid of, thank God, because our apartment is like a furnished apartment. So it's really just our clothing, but it's still like packing and cleaning and sorting and then we have Purim. So it's like we're leaving on a bang, like, and it's also a very long Purim here. Like in Israel, a lot of people celebrate 2 days because there's a Shushan Purim,
Mhm.
which like we just like in America, we just acknowledge, but in Jerusalem, they celebrate Shushan Purim. So what everyone does is everyone celebrates Purim, the regular day out of Jerusalem, and everyone comes to Jerusalem for Purim. So it's like, it feels like an extended Purim weekend. So it's also pretty exciting.
Good. Well, it's a good way to leave on such
Yeah,
a nice
exactly.
experience.
Exactly. It's really fun. So yeah, okay, I think we're ready to begin. Let's start. So in anticipation of Purim, like we've been learning about the 7 women prophets. And so today we're going to wrap it up with the final 2. We kind of started like at the last ones and worked our way up. So now we're going to talk about Sarah and we're going to talk about Miriam. Most of us are more familiar with Sarah and Miriam than with the other prophets that we've been discussing. But still, there's so much to be learned and so much to be discovered about their lives. And on Tuesday, it was International Women's Day. And all over social media, there's this one quote that I kept seeing, like, strong women, may we know them, may we be them, and may we raise them. Such a beautiful quote. And this kind of reminds me of this class because the idea is that women have always learned and been mentored by the women that have preceded them. And we've just carried on their lessons forward into history. And we want to pass those on. So a lot of what we're learning about these women is, I hope it empowers us to recognize our own inner strengths and be able to spread the message. So let's talk about Sarah and Miriam. They're both women who birthed, in a sense. Sarah was the first mother, so she birthed Yitzchak, which was her son, which was started the Jewish nation. And Sarah represents somebody who births in a personal way. Now, for most of us in this class, a lot of us are either beginning our childbearing years or ending our childbearing years or finished our childbearing years. How do we take this message to heart? It doesn't always have to literally mean children, but it could also mean the idea, a concept of spiritual children, the people that we influence that are younger than us, or the people that we influence that are just put in our path. These are our spiritual children. We each, as women, we have the ability to influence other people. And there's a very strong concept in Judaism of spiritual children, the idea that you could have an impact on somebody who's not actually your biological child, but a very strong impact on them nonetheless. And the second woman that we're going to be talking today, which is Miriam, is somebody who represents birthing an environment or birthing a tone in the face of severe oppression and severe hardship. Miriam birthed a certain reality that inspired all the other women in her generation. So I'm really excited to dive into this. So let's start with the whole story of Sarah. We are introduced to Sarah when God tells Abraham that he should leave his homeland. Now, Abraham lived in Iraq, Mesopotamia, and God told Abraham that he was going to go to the land of Israel, and this is going to be the land for you and your people and all your descendants for all time. So we learned that Abraham took his wife, whose name was Sarai, and Abraham and Sarai, they went with a bunch of people and they started just traveling to the land of Israel. Now it's interesting when the Torah tells us that they went with a bunch of people, the Torah doesn't say they went with people. The Torah says that they went with the souls that they made in Haran. Haran is their place that they started from. So all the commentaries love this wording that Abraham and Sarah made souls. And this is the first concept that we see in the Torah of having a spiritual child, because Abraham and Sarah were the first monotheists and they spread the message of monotheism. And we know that Abraham was a teacher for the men and Sarah was a teacher for the women. And the souls basically alludes to people that they sparked their souls, ignited their interest in learning about God, about monotheism. And actually a lot of people were with Sarah and Abraham on their journey as they came into the land of Israel. Now, one thing that the Torah always loves to focus on is the names. We know that in Judaism, names are not arbitrary. Names are connected to our soul and many times to our soul mission. So the name Abraham means can be broken up as Av, father, Hamon, Goyim, father of many nations. Hamon, it means a lot. Goyim means nations. We know the term Goyim to refer as like non-Jews, but actually the term Goyim means nations. So Abraham is the father of many nations. And we're going to get into that. And Sarah, or the word Sarai, as she was called, means princess or ruler or dominionship. And the idea is that Abraham is somebody who's going to birth a lot of nations. He's going to birth the Jewish people. He is going to be the father of like the Arab and Islamic nations later on. He's going to be the father of the Roman and Roman and Greek nations later on. All of the main civilizations from history have actually rooted their descent in Abraham. But Sarah, as a princess or ruler, as a dominionship, is, in general, a princess or a ruler is usually a ruler over just one specific area or specific country or specific province or people. And Sarah is literally going to channel Abraham's father, like Abraham's lineage to her people, and that is the Jewish people. So we actually credit Sarah, we say Abraham is the father of the Jewish people, but he's really also the father of many other nations. So when we talk about who started the Jewish people, it's really Sarah that we're talking about. So the story goes like this. Abraham and Sarah, they come to the land of Israel. They start settling down, and unfortunately, there's a famine in the land of Israel. So Abraham and Sarah realize they can't stay in Israel, and they decide to move to Egypt. Now, what ends up happening is that Sarah or Sarai, I'm going to tend to go back and forth because it's confusing, but she really by now is called Sarai. And they go into the land of Egypt, and Sarah actually gets abducted because she's so beautiful. And she gets abducted by none other than the Pharaoh. So they find this beautiful woman and they say, oh, this woman is fit to be queen to a Pharaoh. And eventually Pharaoh finds out, Pharaoh tries to engage with Sarah, and he just gets stricken by a plague. And he realizes that this is not a normal situation. This is a very special woman, and clearly she's married. And Abraham is reunited with Sarah, and Pharaoh says sorry. And then Pharaoh realizes how special Abraham and Sarah are. He's never met anyone like Abraham and Sarai. So he actually decides to give his daughter, his princess, whose name is Hagar, to Abraham and Sarah. And in Pharaoh's words, Pharaoh says that it's better for my daughter to be a servant in Abraham's house than to be a princess in my house. So he recognizes that Abraham and Sarah are living on a different plane, and he wants his children to be a part of that. So he sends off his daughter to just join Abraham's crew. Now, this is a really interesting situation because we could ask ourselves, okay, what about the princess? What does she want? Is she just sent along to just be part of Abraham and Sarah's crew? And we actually learned from the commentators that because Abraham and Sarah were both prophets, and prophet and prophetess, and actually the sages say that Sarah actually exceeded Abraham in prophecy. Hagar, the Egyptian princess, was actually very excited to be a part of Abraham's household. And she actually saw it as a privilege. Not only that, she also saw it as an honor to be right-hand woman to Sarah, because Sarah was such a special woman, and Hagar was just inspired by her, amazed by her, and wanted to be like her, and was excited for this opportunity to be so in such close contact with Sarah. And Hagar travels back with Sarah and Abraham, and they end up coming back to the land of Israel. Now, all this time, Abraham is being promised that he's going to have a line, a lineage, and that his children are going to be great and numerous and all of this stuff, and they're going to inherit the land of Israel. However, it's been many, many years, and Sarah is still barren. Now, the Torah tells us that she's completely infertile, completely barren, and it's almost to the point of hopelessness. So Abraham and Sarah are just getting older and older, and Sarah realizes that God's plan is going to be fulfilled. Abraham is going to have children, and his children are going to live in and populate the land of Israel and be a light unto the nations. And she's also noticing the reality that she's not getting pregnant, and she's getting a lot older. And then Sarah takes a leap of faith. A lot of times in our life, we have situations where we want things to stay the way that we plan them or the way that we envision them. But one of the hardest things in life, and one of the wisest things in life, is to let go and let God. Let go and let God, that quote, and recognize that unfortunately, or fortunately actually, things don't go according to our plan. Things going to go according to God's plan. And if we're so stuck on our plan, we can never notice that there's actually an opportunity for a greater plan to unfold. I actually read a really beautiful poem about a child who like breaks his toy, and the child gives it to God to fix. And so God starts fixing the toy, and then the child says, no, 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 what are you doing? You're doing it wrong. And God says, just trust me, like, know that I have a plan for you in mind. It's not going to go your way. It might not go the way that you envision it. And many times we pray to God, we want certain outcomes, but the main thing is to always keep in mind that the way that God has it planned out for us, the road might look different. God, at the end of the day, wants the same things that we want for ourselves, the same mazel, the same blessings, all the good things, but the path to which it's going to come through doesn't have to be our plan. And Sarah basically takes a hard swallow, and she realizes that maybe she's not going to be the one that gives birth to Abraham's children, but she takes a very creative and courageous step. And she says, maybe my maidservants, like the lady, this Egyptian princess, Hagar, maybe Abraham's descendants will come through her. And in those days, in general, a servant was the property of their master. So Hagar essentially belonged to Sarah, and all of Hagar's children, by definition, also belonged to Sarah. So Sarah has this plan that, okay, I'll give Hagar to my husband as like a concubine or a secondary wife, and she'll have a child, and then this child is essentially mine. I'll be able to raise this child, and I'll be able to create an environment for this child to lead the nation that God has been promising us about. So she actually tells Abraham, and Abraham is at first very cautious because he was not really sure where this is coming from. And the text tells us that Abraham listened. He listened very carefully, and he realized that this was prophecy. This was not Sarah just acting based on a creative idea. This was something that is meant to happen. So Abraham agrees and takes Hagar for a wife. Now, Hagar, like we said before, like, what does she think about this whole exchange? As a servant, we're told that she's very, very flattered, that she becomes something more of a servant. She becomes more of a secondary wife, like to the next level. And she's actually very proud, and she's very happy. And what happens is that she actually gets pregnant right away. And the moment she gets pregnant, we see a change in Hagar, because Hagar starts to feel arrogant and starts to feel overly confident. And she says to herself, Abraham and Sarah have been married for years, and Sarah hasn't had a baby, hasn't even gotten pregnant once. And look at me, I got pregnant right away. So Hagar starts to think, maybe this whole promise to Abraham about his children and his descendants and being a great nation, maybe it's not from Sarah. Maybe I'm not even a secondary wife. Maybe I should be am I right? I should be Abraham's primary wife, because I'm the one that's giving him his eldest, his firstborn. And Hagar starts to act in a very, very like snide way towards Sarah. And the text says that Hagar starts to despise Sarah. So it used to be the other way around, that Hagar looked up to Sarah. Hagar was eager to learn from Sarah, but now she starts looking at Sarah as being less than her. And Sarah notices this change. She doesn't take it to heart. She is very hurt because her creative plan is not really turning out to follow the way that she thought it would. And Sarah realizes that she had this plan of creating a beautiful environment for Hagar's child and for raising Hagar's child in the proper way. But at the end of the day, she's just realizes this reality that Hagar's child is not hers. And she is not really going to be able to influence Hagar's child to the same degree that she'd be able to influence her own child. And she realizes, okay, this is Hagar's child, and Hagar is going to raise this child in the way that she was taught. as an Egyptian princess. And Sarah says, there's clearly no way that Hagar's child is going to be the father of the Jewish nation. After some time, Abraham is actually promised by God that his children are going to be numerous, like the stars in the sky and like the sand on the shore. And God changes Abraham's name. It was Avram without an H, and now he changes to Avraham. And he changes Sarai's name to Sarah. So he adds the letter Hey, which is the name of God, to their name. And along with that, he promises Abraham that his wife Sarah is going to have a baby. And Abram says, how is that possible? Like, she's so old. And God says, you'll see, I'll promise you this. And Abraham says, okay, so if Sarah has a child, what's going to be with the son of Hagar, whose name is Yishmael? Just want to mention his name is Yishmael. So Avram says, what's going to be with Yishmael? And God says, Yishmael will be a great nation. And we know that Yishmael is the father of all the Arab and Islamic nations. But at the same time that Ishmael is becoming a great nation, God says to Abram, keep your eyes on the prize, stay focused. Yitzchak, who's going to be Sarah's son, is going to be the father of the Jewish nation. And this is the nation I've been telling you about. This is the nation that's going to inherit and occupy the land of Israel. So that's what happens. So eventually, Sarah gives birth to Yitzchak at an old age. And it's a miracle and it's amazing. And then what ends up happening is that over time, there's two women raising two sons in one house. And these sons are very, very different. And Yishmael is a boy who is essentially very, very wild. And he's starting to have a negative influence on Yitzchak. And Sarah notices this. And Sarah's whole goal is to create a proper environment or create a proper upbringing for her son to be the father of the Jewish nation. And she looks at what's happening and she's saying that this cannot happen with Yishmael. Yishmael on his own cannot reach his full potential if he's staying in this house. And my son Yitzchak, there's no way he can fulfill his potential by being influenced by Yishmael. And Sarah takes a hard step and a hard look at the family dynamics and decides to send Hagar and Yishmael away. And this is a very, very painful step for Abraham, because to Abraham, these are both his sons. He doesn't want to send Yishmael away. And especially because Abraham, as we know from many, many sources, is somebody who is like very, very effusive and very, very kind. And he doesn't really have a stern bone in his body. And he really doesn't want to send Yishmael away. And then God tells Abraham something. He says, Shema bekola, listen to her voice. Now, in Hebrew, it literally translates as listen in her voice. What God is saying is that Sarah is not acting out of a place of prejudice. Sarah is not acting out of a place of hurt. Yes, Sarah is very hurt, and there could be a lot of reasons why Sarah has prejudice towards Yishmael and Hagar, but this idea is not coming from them. It's coming from a place of prophecy. And from this, the rabbis learned that Sarah actually exceeded Abraham in prophecy and vision. Sarah in the text is also called by a different name called Yiska. Yiska means to have vision, and it also means to be filled. And rabbis say, what is she filled with? She's filled with prophecy. And Abraham listens to the word of, even though it's very difficult for him, and he sends Yishmael and he sends Hagar away. And there's a whole story about Yishmael and Hagar, and Hagar ends up encountering an angel while she's running away. And the angel tells Hagar a prophecy that your son is also going to lead a great nation, a very, very big, very numerous nation. But Sarah's goal is met. Sarah's goal is always to be the mother of the Jewish nation and to channel all of that blessing that is meant for the Jewish nation into Yitzchak and to prepare him for this role. And as women, the main and primary lesson that we take from Sarah is that there are a lot of difficult steps that we have to take in life, a lot of uncomfortable steps that we have to take in life. And Sarah took two. First, she invites Hagar into her marriage, and then she has to send Hagar away. And both of these seem like they're very, very stern or unemotional decisions, but they are both like times where Sarah looks at the full picture. She looks at the goal and what the goal always is. She always has clarity and she acts based on that. More than that, Sarah acts based on prophecy. The message that we can take for ourselves is that clarity is something that is very difficult for most of us. We pray for clarity. We bless each other with clarity. But when we have clarity, we shouldn't deny that. And we shouldn't like mistake it for something else. When we have clarity, to be in tune that we're having that clarity and to take the necessary steps that it means to get towards the goal of clarity. And sometimes that could be really difficult because in general, we like to stay in our comfort zones, or we like to stay in our plan. But like Sarah, to recognize that even though we don't have prophecy, we still as women have a very, very strong intuition. We have a very strong sense of clarity, and not to ever mistake our clarity and just to go with it and state what's right, do what's right, trust your intuition, and be bold and courageous and creative. And the primary lesson from Sarah, besides for all of that, is always to recognize that your plan and your clarity is aligned with God's plan. And sometimes God's plan seems to align with ours so clearly and so perfectly. And sometimes it doesn't. And we have to trust in God's timing and really act from a place of faith and trust. Somebody told me something recently that I really like, that in order for anything in this world to happen, there needs to be two things in place. Number one, you need to be able to state and know exactly what you want. And number two, God wants to want that for you. And when these two things happen, we're acting as partners with God, and anything, all the blessings, all the mazel is able to manifest itself. And our goals and our visions for ourselves and our family and for our children and for our spiritual children, whether we're teachers or social workers or therapists or pediatricians, we are always in positions where we are affecting the next generation. And Sarah inspires us to do that. Sarah inspires us to really look at what motherhood really is. And motherhood is grooming the next generation in the best way. So that's Sarah. And now we're going to move on to Miriam. Now, Miriam is somebody who had not necessarily a direct impact on certain personalities, but Miriam had a very strong impact on her environment as a whole. Now, Sarah is the first Jewish woman. Miriam comes way, way later. Miriam comes during the time of the story of Passover. The Jewish people end up in the land of Egypt, and they end up becoming slaves to the pharaohs. And it's a really tragic story that we don't even realize how tragic it is. Like a whole generation of people became brainwashed into becoming slaves. And all the Jewish people are slaves for around 200 years in Egypt, day in, day out. And they have unfortunately succumbed to slave mentality. Now, first thing we do, like we said with Abraham and Sarah, is we look at their names. We look at people's names because a name can tell us so much about a person. So Miriam, her name actually means bitter. And the reason that she was called bitter is because she was born at a very, very dark and oppressive time. And at the same time, Miriam, Yam means water. Water alludes to the redemption because the Jewish people left Egypt through the splitting of the sea. But there's also a third meaning to Miriam's name, And that is Mary, which means rebellion. So it's interesting. She has a very loaded name. Her name means bitter, her name means water, and her name also means rebellion. So what sort of rebellion does Miriam represent? Miriam represents this defiance and this fortitude that she actually influenced all the women of her time to believe in, that we are not giving into slave mentality and we are going to be redeemed. And this is something that the Jewish women said throughout the 200 years that they were in slavery. They said this again and again and again. And their husbands and the men around them did not believe it and were very, very broken. And it says in the Midrash and in all different commentaries that why were the Jewish people, why were they zocheh? Why did they merit to leave Egypt? Was there anything special that they did that warranted them to be able to leave Egypt early? And the answer is not really. But the main reason why the Jewish people left Egypt is because of the women. Because the women always believed and always held on to the truth that there is going to be a redemption and we are going to do something about it. If we fast forward years later, when the Jewish people are in the desert and they're building the tabernacle, the portable temple, the women come to Moses with all of their mirrors. And they say, we want to donate these golden mirrors to Mishkan, to the tabernacle. Now, Moshe was familiar with what these mirrors were. These mirrors were very, very precious to the women because when they were in Egypt, their husbands were not interested in building a family. Their husbands were not interested in investing in a family and family life. And the women used these mirrors in order to beautify themselves. And they would go to their husbands and they would actually seduce their husbands through the power of these mirrors. And they would have more children and more children, even though they were living in the most oppressive time in Jewish history. And Moshe says, it seems a little bit out of place for a temple, And God says, actually, these mirrors are the most precious donation to the temple ever, because the women did not lose sight of the goal that the Jewish nation needs to continue, and we are going to get out of slavery. So let's go back to the story of Miriam. So Miriam is a young girl, and she's actually a fellow midwife to her mother. Her mother's a midwife. Her mother's name is Yocheved, and Miriam accompanies her. And Miriam's father is the leader of the generation, is the Jewish leader, the main guy. So Miriam comes from a prestigious family, and we're told that Miriam is given prophecy at a very, very young age, around the age of 6 and 7. And the story is that Pharaoh had this decree that he wanted to kill all the Jewish baby boys. He saw in the stars, or his astrologer saw in the stars, that there's going to be a very powerful leader who will take out all the Jewish people, all the slaves from Egypt. So Pharaoh has this master plan of killing Jewish babies. So first thing he does before he goes public with his plan is he calls the primary Jewish midwives, who are Yocheved and Miriam. Now Yocheved and Miriam had other names. In the Torah, we're told that their names are Shifra and Pua. Miriam is called Pua because while her mother was busy delivering and handling and washing the baby, Miriam would then take the baby and soothe the baby and give it all the emotional love and support. And Pua is a Hebrew word for making gentle noises and calm sounds to the baby and poo-poo-pooing the baby. And Pharaoh basically calls these two midwives and he tells them that he wants them to kill by accident every baby boy that they deliver. And Pharaoh says, if the mother asks what happened, just make something up, So Miriam's first act of rebellion is she actually stands up to Paro at a very young age, and she tells him, she curses him in front of his face, and she tells him that we are not going to do that, and we're not going to listen to your plan. And then Pharaoh gets very upset, and then Yocheved, Miriam's mother, calms her down and says to Pharaoh, she's a little girl, don't listen to her. And that's Miriam's first act of rebellion. But what ends up happening is that the next step, Pharaoh realizes that these midwives are not going to help him in this plan. So he decides to go public and outright start taking babies, snatching babies, throwing them into the Nile. Now, Miriam's father is the leader of the generation, and he basically says, okay, the situation is very, very bleak, and we can't give into the situation. And he makes the decision to actually divorce Miriam's mother, Yocheved, so that there won't be any children that will come from their union anymore. And as the leader of the generation, he knows full well what all the other men are going to do. And all the other men actually divorce their wives. And there's a period where none of the Jewish people are married, and they've given into this slave mentality completely. They say, okay, it's too hard. It's just too hard to continue as a Jewish people. Let's give up. And Miriam actually goes up to her father, and this is not something that normally a child would do, meddle into their parents' business, let alone their parents' divorce. But Miriam stands up to her father and she says to her father, actually, what you're doing now is worse than what Pharaoh's doing. And her father is shocked, and he says, how so? She says, Pharaoh has a decree against the boys, but the message that you're sending to the Jewish nation, to all the people that look up to you, is that we're not going to have Jewish boys nor Jewish girls. And Miriam says, your decree, Pharaoh's decree is against the boys, but yours is against the boys and the girls. You can't do this. And Amram, her father, is so inspired by her that he actually remarries. Shortly after, he remarries his wife, Yocheved, Miriam's mother. And then the message that sends to all the Jews is that we're not going to give up. I made a mistake as a leader, but we're still not going to give up. And the Jewish people all remarry their wives. And Miriam continues her prophecy, and she tells her father, it's important for you to remarry mom, because you and mom are going to give birth to the next leader of the generation. That this leader is going to take us out of Egypt. And this is quite an extravagant prophecy, because if we take a moment to realize the situation that the Jewish people are in, they're literally day in, day out, slaving away. And there's no sight and there's no vision for redemption. And Miriam becomes the leader of thought that the Jewish people are going to be redeemed. There is going to be an after story, and we're going to get out of this place. And when Yocheved and Amram give birth to Moshe, to baby Moses, it says that the whole house is filled with a light. And Amram realizes that this is not an ordinary baby. And he actually takes his daughter, he hugs her, he kisses her, and he says to her, Miriam, your prophecy is coming true. And what ends up happening is they can't hide Moshe. They try to, and they can't. So they send him down the Nile River, and Miriam goes and she watches as her brother floats down the Nile River. At the same time, the princess, the Egyptian princess, her name is Baya, is bathing at the Nile River, and she notices a basket, and she says to herself, this must be a Jewish baby. And she opens the basket, she finds a crying baby. And at that moment, Miriam comes in, saves the day, and says to the princess, I see that you probably need a wet nurse. I know of a really good wet nurse. So the princess basically gives a royal order that this baby should be given to the wet nurse to be weaned for about 2 or 3 years. And that in that way, Moses is reunited with his mother for the first 3 years of his life. And eventually Moses goes back to be a prince in the Egyptian palace. And there's a whole story. And eventually Moses comes back as an adult to Egypt and is the leader of the Jewish people and the 10 plagues, and they're redeemed and they leave Egypt and they cross the sea. And that's the whole story. But Miriam's story goes on and it continues. When they cross the sea, the first thing that we learn that they do is they start singing praise to God. And Miriam pulls out a tambourine, and all the other women pull out a tambourine, and the men are dancing, and the men are singing, but the women are dancing and singing, and they have tambourines. So what's the deal with these tambourines? So Miriam was a leader for the Jewish people up until the story of Moses being a baby, until they're redeemed from slavery. Miriam is always the leader. She is the face of rebellion against oppression, and she's the face of redemption. And all of the women look up towards Miriam. And Miriam has always been teaching the women and always telling the women the same message, that we are going to leave Egypt. We're going to get out of Egypt. And when we do, we're going to be our own nation, and we're going to rejoice, and we're going to thank God, and we're going to be able to serve God. And it actually says that Miriam and the women prepared instruments for the time that they would leave. So these women actually were preparing tambourines and other instruments ready in anticipation for the final redemption out of Egypt. And similar to what we said about the mirrors, the men of the generation had completely lost hope. And they said to their wives, what's the point of making these musical instruments? And the women were very into it. And they said, one day we're going to leave, and it's going to be the biggest party ever. And we're going to receive the Torah. We're going to move to the land of Israel. And we need musicians, we need music. We need instruments to accompany us. And the moment that they cross the sea, the women pull out their instruments that they've been anticipating to use all this time, and they start singing, and they're led by Miriam. Miriam leads the women in dancing and in singing and in playing instruments. One thing that's really beautiful that I see a lot in homes of Israel is tambourines by people's doors, because God willing, we're also anticipating a redemption. We're living in exile, living not in a simple world, in a very, very dark and very, very unpredictable world. And we know that God willing, there's going to be a redemption, and all the Jewish people will be united as one in the land of Israel. And we're going to have the third temple. And in lieu of the whole story of Miriam, a lot of women in Israel hang tambourines by their doors in preparation for the final redemption. And it's something that I've seen all over Israel, and it's very, very special. And the idea is that we are actually the descendants, so to speak, because we're the descendants of the women that left Egypt. We also are the descendants of their message, and we carry their message. And we always believe that nothing is lost, and essentially and eventually we're all going to come back as one and have the final redemption. So this is a message that Miriam started, and Miriam's message still continues till this day. So Miriam accompanies the Jewish people into the desert, and we learn something really beautiful, that Miriam is actually, there are three leaders. There's Moses, her brother, Aaron, her brother, and her. And all three of them are leaders at the same time. Miriam marries a very prestigious head of the tribe of Judah, whose name is Kalev. She has a son named Hor, and she has a very famous grandson named Bezalel, who's the architect of the tabernacle, of the temple. And throughout Miriam's story, we see that Miriam is somebody who is always leading the Jewish people, always inspiring them. There's even an incident where Miriam does something wrong, and she actually says Lashon Hara. She slanders about her brother Moshe by mistake. And people that slandered in those days got some sort of skin rash called leprosy. And Miriam actually has to quarantine for a couple of days outside the camp of Israel. And all of the Jewish people voluntarily wait for her. And we learn from this that there was such an emotional bond and a beautiful connection that many of the people had with Miriam. And throughout the time that the Jewish people were in the desert, there were three ways that God provided for them. Number one, with manna, with food. There were the clouds of glory, which acted as the shelter for the Jewish people. And then the third thing was the well of Miriam, which was their water source along the way. And though also the water always irrigated the area that they settled, that they encamped in. And this well was in the merit of Miriam, and it was called Miriam's well. And some people say that it was a rolling rock that just accompanied them, and then the rock would like be stationary when they camped and then spill out water. And some say that wherever they went, whenever they showed up to like an encampment, there was always a stream of water that was waiting for them, and that was the well of Miriam. And the idea is that Miriam is very connected to water. Miriam stands by the Nile and watches over her brother. By the splitting of the sea, she has a dance party with the women. And then eventually in her merit, the Jewish people are provided with water throughout the time that they're in the desert. So Miriam's message is one of fostering an environment or birthing an environment where you set a tone of what's right and reminding all of the women, reminding all of the people to stay strong. And it was very difficult. Miriam was really a pioneer, standing up to her father, telling her father that you're sending the wrong message by separating from your wife, because eventually we're going to leave Egypt. And what's so beautiful about Miriam is that every time we encounter Miriam in the Torah, we encounter this force of strength and this force of rebellion, because Miriam's name literally means rebellion, in the face of deep oppression, deep suffering. And it's really a strength that many, many women have, and many women learn from Miriam. As they say, there's a really good quote that well-behaved women rarely make history. And it's a cute quote. And that was I think it kind of encapsulates Miriam, because the Jewish people had this slave mentality, unfortunately, from being in the desert, unfortunately, from being in Egypt for so long, that there's nothing we can do. They're so much more powerful than us. We have to give in. And Miriam says, no, we are not going to give in. We know that it will take time, but we can't lose hope and we can't lose faith. And all of us have the ability and strength from Miriam, because Miriam is one of our mothers and Miriam is a prophetess. Miriam prophesied mainly about the redemption of the Jewish people. And all of us have the ability to stay strong in spite of all the obstacles that we face, and to wait patiently and fervently for our own personal redemptions. We spoke about the final redemption, which will come in Mirz Hashem, with God's help, very, very soon, the coming of Mashiach. But all of us, besides for a mass redemption that we are going to all experience, is we all have little personal redemptions in our life that we are waiting for, that we anticipate for. And it could be very, very difficult living without getting to the goal. And the message of Miriam is that always keep your eyes on your personal redemption and never lose hope, and even take rebellious and courageous acts to get there, and not to ever subject to slave mentality. And slave mentality, I think, affects us till this day. It's not the actual act of being a slave, having to show up to work and not getting paid, but a lot of us are slaves to our own thoughts. A lot of us are slaves to what other people think about us. A lot of us are slaves to the culture around us. And whenever we are a slave to something, the best way to know and identify it is to recognize is that this thing is inhibiting us from reaching our goal or reaching our personal redemption. One of the things that people often say, a very good example, is like being slave to your phone. When you're a slave to your phone, you're not able to maximize your time in which you'll be able to do so much. So a lot of us have real struggles and things that unfortunately we just succumb to slave mentality about. We say, too bad, this is the way it is, I just have to give into it. the message of Miriam is to recognize that, no, I don't have to give in. I don't have to just subject passively. I'm able to be an active player in my story. And Miriam's strength, Miriam's fortitude, and Miriam's defiance is really what led the Jewish women to be inspired by her. And we're taught that essentially the Jewish people left the land of Egypt because of the merit of the women, because the women believed. And they all were unified by Miriam because they all looked up to Miriam. So just to wrap up the whole class of all of our female prophets, one thing that's so fascinating about all of these women, one thing they all have in common is that their message still applies till today, still lingers in our reality. And when we look at people that preceded us and the way that they did things, we get inspired. And through the 7 prophetesses, we have Sarah, who we spoke about, Miriam, Devorah, Hannah, Huldah, and Esther. Through these 7 prophetesses, each one, and Abigail, sorry, I knew I was missing one. All of them have messages that are important for us today. And the goal is that we take at least one of these messages to heart and make small incremental changes in our life in order to get to our personal goals, our personal redemption, and in order to feel empowered and proud of ourselves. So I'd love to open up the floor to any discussion or any ideas that resonate and they want to share. You can unmute. And I do want to add that this is also in anticipation for Purim, which the story of Esther is very, very inspiring. Thank you so much, Carol. Thank you for your...
Hi, Hindy.
Hi.
Thank you. I was just going to mention Esther, and you mentioned her. But there is this that same strong woman, throughout history. Like you said, well-behaved women rarely make history, right? And each one of these Jewish women were not necessarily well-behaved, like you said. They were warriors in their own right. And they forged forward and they made history. And that's why we're here today.
Yeah, they all took bold steps, and bold steps that were not for their own selfish, like their own right. It was usually for a bigger goal, bigger picture. And it really was for us. Like when Miriam is talking about redemption, and when Miriam is talking about us leaving Egypt, she's envisioning a future which includes us. And when Sarah sends away Ishmael and invests all of her love into her son Yitzchak and all of her care and all of her upbringing, she's really thinking about us. So we are part of their stories. And especially about Esther's story, Esther stands up to complete annihilation of the Jewish people. Esther is thinking about us. So God willing, there's going to be a Monday night class, right? Right, Ma?
Yep, Monday night's our class. Yeah, looking forward.
And it'll be all about Purim. And God willing, we'll all celebrate Purim, a beautiful Purim, and looking forward to seeing everyone in Palm Beach, God willing, within the next week or 2.
Thank you, Hindy, for a wonderful class.
All the best, and Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom. Thank you, sweetie.